No, and that's only because my mother has died at the age of 89.
Oh.
She came and heard my inaugural speech at Copenhagen Business School, aged about 83, I think, and said how much she'd enjoyed it, but.
Okay. Welcome to Barcelona.
Thank you.
Robert Phillipson's receiving the LinguaPax award for this year, jointly with Professor Sigwan, who
sadly has died, yes.
Did you ever meet him?
Oh yes, no, it would have been a great pleasure to have received it with him personally, and it'll be posthumous in his case, which is very sad.
Mm-hmm. I think part of the award is thanks to your groundbreaking work in the field, in the concept of linguistic imperialism. Could you say a little bit about that and whether you developed it on your own or it's partly a joint effect or effort?
I mean, I think I started simply as being an English teacher, meaning being sent by the British to promote learning of the language worldwide in my young days. And then when I emigrated to Denmark, I found that I got into more and more of the way Scandinavian aid bodies were also trying to support liberation movements in post-colonial Africa. And I got then into the whole business of why English had remained even more powerful after independence for countries like Nigeria, Kenya, India, and looked into the role of English in relation to other languages. And at that point, my wife, Tove Skutnap-Kangas, was working on similar issues of linguistic hierarchy or linguistic discrimination, and the way some languages were being strengthened and others were being marginalized. So that she evolved the concept linguicism in parallel with racism and sexism and other forms of inequality maintenance. And linguistic imperialism is an example of linguicism. It has to do with some interests being promoted at the expense of others, and where definitely there was a history of this internally within, say, the United Kingdom vis-à-vis Welsh and Scottish and other Celtic languages, and the same in the United States and in Australia and other countries like that. And this was exported to the colonial world, and it has been maintained since that time, which is why there are issues of language policy which have to do with why some languages are strengthened and others are either weakened or even killed off. So linguistic imperialism looks at structures within which language plays a crucial role in social goods and in privilege.
You've written that there used to be an English empire and now it's the empire of English.
Absolutely, and clearly for the last 60, 70 years it has been English very much on the increase worldwide, and in that sense the concept needs to be adapted to very specific contexts within countries or within, say, the EU system, and one needs to work with a theoretical concept which is flexible. But if one is talking about anything as controversial, obviously the term itself is not something that people in power feel happy with. One needs to be very specific about what one is talking about and whether there is basic injustice at stake or not.
You mentioned the EU. I think the common market worked linguistically, let's say, without English basically, until Great Britain and Ireland joined the community.
In 73,
in 73.
With Denmark at the same time.
At the same time, exactly.
And Denmark only joined because the agricultural market for Danish bacon and butter was the United Kingdom, so that they went in for purely economic reasons, which are right, that this was the point where French, which had been the dominant internal language of the EU institutions, was challenged by another internationally big language getting in the door, and gradually over the last 35 years or so the position of English has been progressively strengthened for a whole range of reasons. And I think that talking about EU, European Union language policies is often to some extent unclear or even at cross purposes, because when people generalize about language policy, you need to be very specific as to whether you're talking about speech or writing, and it's a very different position in relation to different uses, and you need to know whether you're talking about the Parliament or the Commission or other EU bodies internally, or else they're external functions and they're dealings with the general public or with experts from, say, Spain or Ireland or Latvia taking part in meetings and so on. So that there are so many different uses of language that one does need to be cautious about generalizing. And certainly people who are employed by an EU institution, they are no longer employed as citizens of a country, but as European civil servants. And it's perfectly logical that those people should, in fact, be expected to function multilingually. Whereas if you're an expert in fish quotas or energy,
or an MEP even.
Or yes, exactly. Then it's very important that you should be able to use the language which you feel most comfortable in. And that means that the provision of interpretation facilities and translation facilities is an issue of democratic principle. And unfortunately, the way issues have been managed, it's often been regarded as a question of economy, of budget, rather than equality in communication. And that's where it gets very tricky. And I think it's been very good that Catalan NGOs and NGOs in France and Germany and other places who feel that their language or languages are not being given the same treatment as French or French or English, the big ones, have raised the issue of strengthening language rights within the whole EU system. But unfortunately, the experience is that when you have a new draft constitutional treaty being processed by a lot of eminent people, or when you have policies on multilingualism, the issues of democratic equality in communication tend to get forgotten or ignored. So there are a lot of good proposals for making what happens more explicit or more egalitarian don't seem to have really ever been seriously taken on board, and that to some extent is because the language policy issues are complex and messy, and even though in many ways the interpretation and translation services are the people who are defenders of multilingualism, they are up against economic constraints and they're up against all sorts of other pressures to do with people's attitudes. And that's where it was a translator from this country, Spain. I don't know whether he was a mother tongue speaker of Spanish, Castilian, or any other. I have no idea. But he said to me back in would have been 1998 or something like that, when I was doing fieldwork. No, 2000, for a book on European language policies. That, so far as the written language is concerned, well, you must know this. I mean, most of the European Union policy texts are written in the most boring possible language. They're not anything that ordinary citizens would choose to read. So it has to do with the sort of democratic deficit of the whole EU system. But he said to me with a twinkle in his eye, you do realise that all of those texts in the 23 official or working languages, they're all thinly disguised French. He'd started when French was the dominant internal language. Well, now they're very undisguised English, because 80% of the documents produced initially in the Commission, which is the main source of texts, they're drafted in English.
Mostly by non-native English speakers, we might add.
When Newsweek, the American weekly, interviewed Romano Prodi about crises, a lot of it was to do with the crisis in the economy and why Europeans don't love the Americans enough, and it was an American journalist interviewing Prodi, and he was at that time the president of the Commission, so he was the person whose job was to guarantee the integrity of all EU languages. And this was before regional official languages like Catalan, Valencian and Basque and Welsh and Irish Gaelic had been accepted for certain purposes. The journalist asked Brodie, well, what's happening with all these languages? Aren't they a big problem? Or something like that. And Brodie, instead of saying, of course we're proud of multilingualism, we really believe in maintaining diversity, what did he say? He said, well, Europe is being unified by broken English. And he sounded pleased about that. And this again shows that the gap between a legal responsibility to maintain equality and the way people think about language policies when they're employed in the system often is at odds. There are conflicts there between nice words on paper and the reality of solving everyday problems, of getting things done, and the way the whole business of managing diversity tends not to take on board sufficiently the issue of diversity, linguistic diversity.
My impression is that the English-speaking world in Europe and the rest of the continent only agree on one catchphrase, but with completely different meanings, which is English is not enough, which for the UK is it's an attempt to get companies to learn and use other languages, but on the continent is really to say you need more than one foreign language. So the catchphrase is the same, but perhaps the intention is different. My impression is that European institutions are making a big effort to let's say, close the floodgates against an onslaught of English, which seems to be pushed by economic motives.
Yeah, I think this is true, and I think that the policy documents produced by the Commissioner for Multilingualism, because there has, since the arrival of Romania and Bulgaria, been one person who is a commissioner exclusively with responsibility for multilingualism. Those have been trying to push an agenda of support for learning Mother Tongue +2. Whether Mother Tongue means a minority language or only the state's dominant language is unclear. It's left deliberately unclear, I think.
I think so.
And they're doing this for commercial reasons. They do stress the links between business and multilingualism, and I think that the business world understands the need for multilingual competence more than the politicians, actually. But all of this is recommendations. So it's something that all the member states have agreed on as something desirable, but implementation depends entirely on whether each state does anything to ensure that children do learn more than one language, or that universities run in more than one language. And this means that the United Kingdom can allow all children to stop learning any foreign language at age 14, and they will never learn 2 foreign languages except for a tiny proportion of an age group. And it means that the issue of a multilingual state like Spain is more complicated than states which see themselves as monolingual. Whether they are or not, of course, is debatable. But it does mean that the whole business of whether you really do ensure competence in 3 languages is up to the individual state. And one of the sad developments, I think, in Scandinavia, where I live in Denmark now, is that traditionally it hasn't been only English which people learn. There have always been strong departments of German, of Romance languages, of Slavic languages, and for a whole range of reasons to do with pop culture, media culture, with the dominance of Americanization generally, more and more students are becoming competent in English with the support of the education system, and fewer take seriously the challenge of also becoming competent in say, French or Spanish or Polish or Russian. And this means that the number of people choosing to study them in higher education in Scandinavia and in Finland is going down. And that means that the ideals of one Mother Tongue +2 may or may not be being achieved. And it takes decades to build up a good infrastructure with good research and good teaching of these languages. And I think that the politicians, for short-term reasons, don't take these issues seriously enough. And one of the reasons, I think, is also that the interaction between the Commission planning the strengthening of multilingualism and member states is not ideal, because some member states have a strong language policy infrastructure at universities and in ministries, and I think this applies in this country. It probably applies in Finland. It may apply in Sweden, but possibly not in any other European member state. So that the infrastructure is weak when it comes to language policy, and the infrastructure is weak within the EU system. Because when we have a new commission, which has now been in operation for, 4 months, something like that, the specific portfolio for multilingualism has disappeared. So multilingualism is being downgraded. And the commissioner now in charge of education, culture and youth also has multilingualism as one of her concerns. But in her first website interview stating out her policies, language policy was not mentioned.
Not mentioned.
And this is symptomatic, I'm afraid, of the way things are being left to market forces, rather than to the noble ideals of encouraging and respecting diversity being taken seriously.
You mentioned universities, and I think they have a special role, but in this era of competitiveness and internationalization, my impression is that they are offering more and more courses for foreign students through the medium of, back to English we come. Are universities doing all they can, or could they do more, or could they work in other ways to promote multilingualism? Sorry, we don't have very long for your answer, but I'm asking you far too many questions. Sure.
No, but I mean, but in a way, if I've talked too long about the EU system, that's partly because the issues are complex, and it's very easy to oversimplify. No, but it's the right question though, because my institution is an old trade school in Denmark, where people used to, in the languages faculty, train secretaries to function in 3 languages. We've expanded, we now train interpreters, we have American studies, British studies and so on. So there is a big languages dimension, unlike American business schools. And we started calling ourselves Copenhagen Business School a couple of years ago. And my rector, Vice-Chancellor, decided unilaterally 5 years ago to make American English the corporate language of Copenhagen Business School. And 70 of my colleagues and myself wrote a polite letter saying, have you really thought this through? We're a European business school. We have a tradition of aiming at British English and other languages. Were you thinking of the website? Were you thinking of publications? And of course the answer was he hadn't thought any of those things through. He just wanted to make it appetizing for international students or something like that. He was forced to cancel this decision and establish a policy committee which has made a set of very good recommendations for maintaining diversity with a balance between Danish and English for various purposes, and which of them is used should be ad hoc, it should be according to need. And now all of the Danish higher education institutions have been asked to formulate policies for diversity, for maintaining more than Danish, more than just English, or alternatively either Danish or English. There hasn't been much progress in making these documents explicit, whereas in Finland, if you go to the University of Helsinki, their website has lots of very good statements about the way everything should be in 2 local official languages, the minority in terms of demography language, Swedish and Finnish, plus English, but also other languages too, and regarding multilingualism as a resource and not a problem. But I'm afraid that the Bologna process, which everyone in higher education in Europe nowadays knows a lot about, if you look at the policy statements every 2 years when ministers meet from 46 countries, internationalization means English medium higher education, because language policy has not been seriously integrated into all of these other measures to increase accountability, foreign travel, quality control and all those other things. And again, this is a missed opportunity for language policy, having bilingual degrees. This would be a wonderful opportunity for doing that, and could be done, provided there's the competence. And when you say that universities increasingly offer courses in English, yes, this is very true in Northern Europe. And many of my colleagues who are Danes are now expected to be able to function just as well in English as in Danish, which of course is a very unfair demand to make on people. But the University of Copenhagen now has a very good team which is going to certify whether the Danes who are doing elite MA programs have good enough English. And they're working with the specialists in certain areas within, say, natural sciences or engineering or whatever. So there's going to be both upgrading of skills and very interesting research into how, for instance, if you were to teach the same course in Catalan and in English, whether you do it the same way, whether students understand the same amount, and so on. There are very interesting issues there. And there are lots of challenges there, I think, in trying to make universities diverse in ways that do meet real needs. Because clearly I imagine that universities here should be trying to make people supremely competent in the local unifying language, which may be Catalan for most people, Spanish obviously, Castilian, but also English for other purposes. And I think that a lot of people in our part of the world understand that there is a desirability and that it can be achieved, provided the school system equips people. Yeah. Because you can't study any subject in any area in the 4 Nordic countries, Norway, Denmark, Sweden, Finland, without being able to read English texts. There's no extra language support given to university students. They are expected in pharmacy or chemistry or history to be able to read not only in their mother tongue but also text in English. And the school system delivers that to a large extent, so that the teaching of English is good enough to have equipped people to do that. Otherwise they can't survive in the school system or in higher education. So that if one wants the universities to live up to ideals of diversity, then it has to be in partnership with teacher training and with what's happening in schools. And this is, I think, probably something where Finland is nearest to living up to this. Sweden close behind, Norway possibly also close behind, and Denmark lagging behind after that, actually. So that there's an understanding of many of the issues, but actually living up to the ideals is still much more problematical.
English for many people is a very foreign language, particularly for Romance speakers and people from the rest of the world. And I sometimes think, and I'd like your opinion as someone who lives in Scandinavia, if you agree, that with a much smaller investment, Catalan speakers could learn enough Italian to be able to get by at Italian universities, or French speaker in Portuguese, and perhaps within Scandinavia as well. But I don't know if there's kind of mentalization that our more local languages can be, at least at the passive level, the understanding level, very useful for our neighbours.
Absolutely, and I think you're right. Traditionally, the 3 Scandinavian languages have been used in collaboration, so that the Danes speak their mother tongue, the Swedes, the Norwegians the same. Just the same could be achieved through the school system for Romance languages, and there have been some kind of efforts to achieve this. The French promoted this, and they called it intercomprehension or something like that.
Intercomprehension, they're keen on that.
I don't know whether this has got really into the school system in a big way, just the same as language awareness is also being used in interesting ways, in pockets, in different parts of France. But I think you're right. I mean, the idea that everyone should concentrate on English doesn't make sense, because clearly when Danish companies, and this has been researched, have trouble in selling in Japan or in Italy, what Danish sales directors complain about is the lack of English competence of the Italians and the Japanese, rather than their own ability to function in Italian or Japanese. And this is symptomatic of the way, if you only think in English only terms, you're shutting lots of doors for intercultural understanding and for regional integration. And one suspects that if American dominance now, perhaps because of the crises in the economy and the finance world, and because of Chinese increased power, if American dominance decreases in the coming years, the European Union ought to react to that and ought to be putting much more effort into maintaining cultural links across the whole of the European Union. I think the tricky thing there is that until 1992, with the Maastricht Treaty, language policy, education and culture were national prerogatives. The EU was not supposed to interfere or support. And that means that the amount of money for the kind of thing that you're talking about there, for collaboration across the Mediterranean area, has never existed. And this means that even if massive amounts of money are going into school foreign language learning, it may not be a good investment always, for a variety of reasons, but it certainly isn't thinking in visionary terms about how different ways of managing multilingualism and multilingual learning could be achieved. And I think that it's definitely true that in Finland or Sweden there are definitely people who would far rather learn Spanish or Catalan than only English. There has always been an interest in southern Europe, in the north. And unfortunately, in the last decade or so, there hasn't been enough attempt to build on this so that education systems would equip people more to function in a more diverse way.
Right now we find that English has almost completely replaced French in schools.
Really, here?
As a result of parental pressure particularly, which has left a lot of French teachers having to, let's say, relearn another language. But when it comes to the job market, English is now beginning to be taken for granted. In other words, it's ceasing to have an added value. And a lot of firms are looking for French because that's our main market. And the people with good French are just not coming into the system.
It's very similar with German in Denmark, because Germany is the biggest market.
Of course.
And most small and medium-sized companies need German. And until now, Scandinavian companies have been able to do that, and they won't if no teachers are qualified to ensure that there's good teaching of those languages. So it's exactly parallel there, and it just shows that the education system is too short-sighted, and that parents are not aware of the challenges which the business world may be instrumental in trying to change, because if the business world complains enough, this might influence politicians, which could reverse this drift into a kind of English-only world.
A funnel kind of system.
Yeah, sure. And it would also strengthen the interest in, say, Northern Europe in learning Italian and Catalan and Spanish.
Definitely.
Sure.
I mean, diversity must be the way forward.
Yeah.
Perhaps this last question will be related to the fact that you've been living in Denmark for years, Danish being a medium-sized language, and which has probably been aware, well, let's say that the Danes as such have been aware of the existence of larger languages, the importance of learning languages, let's say the need to cater for a much more multilingual world far sooner than the French say, or the Germans say.
Exactly.
I was going to ask, how do you see the future of languages like Danish, which must have 5 or 6 million speakers?
5.5, yes.
Catalan, also called Valencian, which has 8-9 million.
Yeah, sure.
How do you see their future, and what do you think their role can be in helping larger language communities to face up to the change in the sort of hierarchy of roles?
It means that state governments need to take these issues seriously. In fact, Danish you might think of as being a small language in some ways, and most Danes do, but there are over 100 universities worldwide where Danish language and literature are studied, but most Danes wouldn't realise that. But provided the government actually makes an effort to see what the role is nationally and what sort of interest there is worldwide, then they can try to formulate policies to ensure that the language does not become marginalized through more use of English. And this is where the Nordic governments, Iceland as well as the other countries I mentioned, now do have a policy statement which is supposed to raise language awareness within each country and to encourage diverse types of parallel competence. So that this is definitely an attempt to ensure that within the country a unifying national or local regional official language doesn't get marginalized excessively. And in the way, the EU system could strengthen that, because the fact that, say, Estonian or Bulgarian now have official language status and working language status does mean that those languages are also being internationalized in the European Parliament and the Commission to a smaller extent. But through the translation services, this is happening. So in a way, it's up to the locals to realize that demographically other languages are much bigger, but this doesn't diminish the importance for another community of maintaining and building on their traditions which have been built up over centuries. And I think there is a greater, at least in the Nordic countries, there's a great awareness now of the need to ensure that all languages maintain their vitality. I think one can be optimistic about political statements, and then it's a question of whether this actually filters through into resources and conscious policies within institutions, and obviously universities and schools need to set a good example there, and television channels as well. I think the amount of American junk on television, of course in the original soundtrack in our part of the world, that makes a big difference for the learning of languages. But clearly there could be much more to support having films with the original soundtrack of a whole range of languages with subtitles. So that it doesn't need to be mainly American stuff plus the occasional Spanish or Italian film. It could be much more diverse if there was enough realization at the EU level and at the national level that there are very big issues at stake here which are important for the future of European identity.
Yeah. Well, almost moved into linguistic monopolies, certainly economic and sectoral monopolies in the field of cinema. And cinema's certainly been is a hot issue right now, because everything is still dubbed across Spain in the cinemas not into each of the languages, but just into Spanish.
Into Castilian.
And well, let's see.
Even Harry Potter. I thought that Harry Potter had been dubbed into Catalan.
Harry Potter, not the very first film, but there were some cinemas where a Catalan version was available. Yes,
sure.
And very successful indeed.
Yeah, I'm sure. Yeah, sure. But it is puzzling in a way, living in Northern Europe, that you don't get the original soundtrack with subtitles. Yeah, sure. I mean, this would be a big support for language learning.
Enormous.
Meaning receptive competence would be promoted. A receptive competence of a range of languages. I mean, why don't you listen to Portuguese or Italian on films from those countries here? It would obviously be a way of implementing diverse competences within a Romance family language.
Definitely. Well, in fact, let's go and see if we can find a cinema. Thank you very much indeed, Robert.
My pleasure.
It's very interesting.
It's great to come to a part of the world where language policy is taken seriously.
And where
a great honour to be part of LinguaPax.
I was going to say, and where LinguaPax actually supports that claim.
It's a wonderful effort by you Catalans, which the rest of the world can learn from.
And it's a privilege for us to invite you here to give you an award, which is highly deserved.
It's a great honour. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.